We've all heard that Florida means theme parks, retirees, and way too many news stories that start with the words, Florida man. But underneath the surface of this state, literally underneath it, something is hiding that makes all of that look embarrassingly small. Beneath the rivers, the springs, and the ancient sinkholes that dot the landscape between Tallahassee and the Gulf, there are bones. There are tools. There are the remnants of people who lived here 15,000 years ago, hunting creatures that most of us only know from museum skeletons, navigating a version of this state so different from what exists today that it might as well be another planet. And for decades, almost nobody knew any of it was there. Now, a small group of underwater archaeologists working in near-zero visibility, fighting broken equipment, water moccasins, and a scientific establishment that told them they were wrong, are pulling that buried world back into the light. What they are finding is not just rewriting Florida history. It is rewriting the story of how and when humans first arrived in the Americas. So strap in, because the Sunshine State has been keeping secrets in its swamps for 14 millennia, and we are about to drag every single one of them up from the bottom. This is the underwater Florida cave dig that could rewrite Ice Age survival. Here's the thing about Florida that nobody tells you in geography class. The whole state is basically a giant sponge. Underneath the grass and the strip malls and the theme park parking lots sits an enormous platform of limestone, and limestone, as it turns out, is about as watertight as a paper bag in a rainstorm. Groundwater has been quietly dissolving that rock for millions of years, carving out caves and tunnels and hollow chambers beneath the surface. And when those chambers get big enough and weak enough, the roof collapses. That is how you get a sinkhole. Florida has thousands of them. They show up in backyards. They swallow cars. They open up under houses overnight. But here is the part that makes archaeologists lose their minds with excitement. When those sinkholes fill with water, they become the single best natural preservation system on the planet for organic material. Bones that would rot in weeks on the surface can survive 15,000 years at the bottom of a flooded sinkhole. Stone tools, mastodon teeth, ancient pollen, even mastodon dung, all of it locked in layers of sediment like pages in a book that nobody has opened yet. The chemistry is the key. As groundwater passes through decaying leaves and plant matter on the surface, it picks up natural acids that destroy bone. But when that water hits the limestone walls of a sinkhole, the rock neutralizes the acid the same way an antacid tablet neutralizes the burn in your stomach. The sinkhole just quietly cancels the destruction. Add to that the cold, dark, low oxygen conditions at the bottom, and you have got conditions so stable, they border on miraculous. Scientists call this region the epicenter of submerged prehistory on the planet. They are not being dramatic. They mean it literally. So here's where the story gets genuinely infuriating, in the best possible way. Back in the 1980s, two Florida archaeologists named David Webb and Jim Dunbar were poking around a 30-foot deep sinkhole in the Aucilla River called Page-Ladson. What they found there should have set the entire field of American archaeology on fire. Instead, it got buried almost as effectively as the artifacts themselves. See, at the time, the dominant model in American archaeology was something called Clovis first. The idea was straightforward. The first people to arrive in the Americas were the Clovis people, big game hunters who crossed a land bridge from Asia and pushed through an ice-free corridor into the continent around 13,000 years ago. They left behind these large, beautifully crafted fluted stone points, and every site, every date, every piece of evidence seemed to fit that timeline neatly. It was a clean story. Archaeologists loved it. Then Webb and Dunbar started pulling things out of Page-Ladson. They found mastodon bones with cut marks in places that could only have been made by human hands. They found stone tool fragments in the same sediment layer. They sent everything off for radiocarbon dating, and the results came back at 14,400 years old. That is 1,400 years before Clovis was even supposed to exist. The archaeological establishment's response was essentially a very polite version of sit down and be quiet. Critics argued the artifacts must have shifted layers. They said you could not trust underwater excavation the same way you trusted work on land. Nobody had figured out how to do underwater archaeology with the same scientific rigor as a terrestrial dig, and so the whole thing got dismissed, filed away, and largely forgotten for nearly 2 decades. The site just sat there, waiting. Let's pause for a second and actually absorb what 14,500 years means. That is not just old, that is incomprehensibly, staggeringly, almost insultingly old. The pyramids of Egypt are roughly 4,500 years old. The Roman Empire peaked around 2,000 years ago. 14,500 years ago, there were people standing in what is now Florida, looking out at a landscape that would be completely unrecognizable to anyone alive today, hunting animals that have been extinct for so long we had to dig them out of riverbeds just to know they existed. The Clovis first model had placed the arrival of humans in the Americas at around 13,000 years ago, and that date was treated for decades like it was written in stone. Page-Ladson did not just nudge that date back a little, it blew a 1,400-year hole straight through it. And if people were here before the ice-free corridor between the glaciers was even open, that raises an entirely new and deeply uncomfortable question: how did they get here? The leading alternative theory is that they came by boat, hugging the coastline from Asia, island hopping and beach hopping their way down into the Americas long before any land route was available. But here is the twist that makes the Florida sites so uniquely valuable. The coastline those earliest Americans would have walked along is now underwater. Sea levels 15,000 years ago were roughly 300 feet lower than they are today. The beaches, the camps, the fire pits, the middens full of shellfish, all of it is sitting out on the submerged continental shelf beneath the Gulf of Mexico. The sinkholes of the Aucilla River are not just archaeological sites. They are the only dry land windows left into a world that the ocean swallowed whole. All right, let's paint the picture, because Ice Age Florida was not just a little different from what it is today. It was a completely different planet wearing Florida's name tag. Forget the humidity, forget the mangroves, forget the alligators sunning themselves on golf course banks. 15,000 years ago, sea levels were so much lower that the Florida landmass was roughly twice the size it is today. The coastline sat 300 feet below where it currently is, meaning everything that is now the shallow Gulf of Mexico was dry land, grasslands, river valleys, sinkholes, and freshwater springs, stretching out for miles beyond the modern shore. And the climate was cold and dry, nothing like the subtropical swamp state we know today. What covered most of Florida was not jungle or swamp, but open grassland, a vast, windy, semi-arid savanna dotted with patches of pine and scrub. Think less Everglades and more Serengeti. And the Serengeti comparison is not accidental, because what was living on those grasslands would stop you dead in your tracks. Colombian mammoths, the size of double-decker buses, were grazing the open plains. Mastodons were browsing the woodlands at the edges. Herds of prehistoric horses thundered across the flatlands. Yes, horses, in Florida, long before the Spanish ever showed up with theirs. Ancient camels wandered the river margins. Giant ground sloths the size of modern elephants lumbered through the scrub. Prehistoric bison roamed in numbers that would have darkened the horizon. Pollen records pulled from the sediment layers at Page-Ladson confirm it a cool, dry environment, dominated by grasses and low shrubs. Exactly the kind of landscape that draws massive herds of grazing animals. And wherever massive herds of grazing animals go, hunters follow. The first Floridians followed them straight into the sinkhole country. Now let's talk about a mastodon that has been causing serious problems for people who thought they had American prehistory figured out. At a site called Simpson's Flats inside Ichetuckney Springs State Park, a mastodon skeleton is doing something extremely inconvenient. It is eroding out of the riverbank, and not slowly. The sediment that has been capping and protecting this skeleton for thousands of years is washing away at what archaeologists describe as an alarming rate, which means the clock is ticking, and the window to learn anything from it is closing fast. So a team of underwater archaeologists has gone in on an emergency mission to document everything they can before the river takes it. And what they are finding is making people very uncomfortable in the best possible scientific way. Here is the thing about a mastodon skeleton that is just sitting in a riverbed on its own. It is a fossil. Interesting, sure, but not revolutionary. What makes Simpson's Flats different is the company the mastodon is keeping. In the sediment layers surrounding the bones, researchers have found microdebitage, tiny, razor-thin flakes of stone that are knocked off when someone is sitting there making a tool. You do not get microdebitage from a river. You do not get it from geological processes. You get it from a human being, sitting next to a mastodon, chipping away at a piece of chert. And if that were not enough, back in the 1980s, Paleo-Indian stone points were reported from the same site. But the detail that really lands like a sledgehammer is the tusk. One of the mastodon tusks bears cut marks in a location that would have been inside the animal's skull while it was still alive. There is only one explanation for cut marks in that particular place. Something with hands put them there. By the early 2000s, work on submerged prehistoric sites in Florida had ground to a complete halt. Page-Ladson was sitting at the bottom of the Aucilla River, ignored, its secrets locked in sediment layers that nobody was willing to fight the scientific establishment to excavate. Then, a researcher named Jessie Halligan decided she was going to restart the whole thing. And what followed was one of the most grueling, unglamorous, and ultimately triumphant stories in the history of American archaeology. The first field season in 2012 was a disaster. A tropical storm hit almost immediately. The equipment they inherited from the original Page-Ladson era was a decade old and spectacularly unreliable. Engines would not start. Pumps seized up. Boats that had been sitting in people's backyards for 10 years had holes in them. Halligan spent the better part of her first 2 field seasons not excavating ancient artifacts, but cleaning carburetors and patching hulls and coaxing decrepit dredge systems back to life. They found almost nothing archaeologically that year, but she came back. And she kept coming back. Then came the day that changed everything. Dr. Mike Waters, one of the most respected figures in the field, was on site and had essentially told the team that if nothing turned up this season, Page-Ladson was finished. And then Morgan, one of the divers, came exploding to the surface. They had found a biface, a stone knife, unambiguous, unmistakable, sitting in situ in the sediment layer dating to 14,500 years ago. Halligan described it as more than she ever thought she would find. They radiocarbon dated everything surrounding it, with what one researcher called overkill precision samples, collected from all around the artifact like a constellation of proof. The dates held. Page-Ladson was real. The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, and National Geographic all came calling. Clovis first was finished. Before we get to the final piece of this story, if the idea of ancient people surviving in Ice Age Florida has you curious about where your own ancestors fit into all of this, head over to the OriginDNA website. I have a 3-volume PDF guide bundle that shows you exactly how to read your raw DNA data and maximize your Ancestry or 23andMe results. Link is in the description. But don't go yet. The last part of this video is the most important. Now, let's talk about what those first Floridians were actually up against every single day they woke up. Because we have been painting this picture of a dramatic, adventurous Ice Age landscape without mentioning the part where everything in it was actively trying to kill you. The predator lineup in Pleistocene Florida was so stacked it reads like something a game designer would come up with if you asked them to make a survival horror setting and told them not to hold back. Start at the top, with the American lion bigger than any lion alive today, roughly the size of a modern tiger, and almost certainly a pack-capable ambush predator. Right alongside it was Smilodon fatalis, the famous saber-toothed cat, with canine teeth long enough to punch through the skull of a juvenile mammoth. Then there was a large jaguar, the same species that still roams South America today, just without the benefit of thousands of years of humans hunting it into wariness. Florida panthers were also present. Then the dire wolves, larger than any modern wolf, running in packs, capable of bringing down prey that would make a modern gray wolf turn around and go home. 2 species of bears patrolled the landscape, and the alligators, freed from the pressure of human hunting, grew to sizes that would make the largest modern specimens look like pets. Even the herbivores were lethal. A threatened mammoth or mastodon is not an animal that goes down easy or quietly. Around 12,700 years ago, something went catastrophically wrong in Florida, and the evidence for it is sitting in the sediment layers at Page-Ladson in a form that nobody expected. Not bones, not tools, fungal spores. Specifically, a category of fungal spores called coprophilous fungi spores that are produced almost exclusively in association with the dung of large herbivores. Mastodons produce them, mammoths produce them, Deer and rabbits produce them in quantities so small they barely register. So, when you pull a sediment core from an ancient sinkhole and count the concentration of these spores layer by layer, you are essentially counting the megafauna. And at Page-Ladson, right at the 12,700-year mark, the concentration of those spores does not gradually decline. It does not slowly taper off over centuries. It drops off the charts almost overnight in geological terms. The mammoths are gone. The mastodons are gone. The horses, the camels, the giant ground sloths, all of them vanishing from the Florida landscape within what amounts to a geological eye blink. The culprit was the Younger Dryas, a catastrophic climate reversal that hit just as the world was warming out of the last glacial maximum. Within the span of a few human generations, temperatures plummeted, conditions turned arid and brutally cold, and the ecosystems that had sustained the megafauna for thousands of years simply collapsed. And the collapse did not stop with the animals. Megaherbivores are keystone species. They are the architects of their own ecosystems. When they disappeared, the vegetation they had been constantly cropping and managing exploded into dense growth. And dense growth burns. Sediment cores from Florida sites show a dramatic spike in charcoal deposits right after the megafauna extinction, as wildfires tore across a landscape that had lost its natural grazers. The first Floridians watched their entire world burn. Here is the part of this story that does not get nearly enough credit. The megafauna are gone, the climate has gone haywire, the wildfires are reshaping the landscape, and the protein sources that sustained the first Floridians for generations have vanished almost overnight. And yet the people stayed. Not only did they stay, they adapted so completely and so creatively that they gave rise to entirely new cultural traditions that archaeologists can trace through the archaeological record like a thread running through centuries of change. The descendants of those first Floridians became what archaeologists call the Swanee people, and the tools they left behind tell a story of radical flexibility. Where the earliest Paleo-Indians carried large, general-purpose weapons designed for taking down megafauna, the Swanee toolkit is a Swiss Army knife of survival adzes for woodworking, scrapers for processing hide and bone, smaller, more versatile points suited for a wider range of prey. At a site called Ryan Harley on the Wacissa River, archaeologists pulled over 1,000 artifacts from in situ sediment layers, an almost incomprehensible abundance by the standards of this kind of work. The Swanee points found there are so locally specific that they only appear in and around Florida, suggesting these people were no longer nomadic wanderers, but a culture that had staked out this peninsula as their own and adapted to its particular demands. And then as the climate stabilized and sea levels continued to rise, bringing new coastal resources online, those adaptations deepened further. By the Middle Archaic period, early Floridians were harvesting oysters in massive quantities from a coastline that was still actively shifting beneath their feet. They were burying their dead in freshwater mortuary ponds preserved so perfectly that researchers recovered the actual brain tissue of individuals who died 7,000 years ago. These were not survivors clinging on. These were people thriving. Here is the uncomfortable truth about everything we have just told you. All of it. The biface at Page-Ladson, the cut-marked mastodon tusk at Simpson's Flats, the 1,000 artifacts at Ryan Harley, the fungal spore extinction record, the mortuary ponds. All of it represents the tiniest imaginable fraction of what is actually out there. The Aucilla River alone has dozens of unexplored sinkholes. The land between Tallahassee and the Suwannee River is riddled with karst formations that have never been excavated. And then there is the continental shelf. Remember that the Florida coastline 15,000 years ago sat 300 feet below where it is today, meaning there is an entire submerged coastal plain out in the Gulf of Mexico that was once dry land. Once walked on, once camped on, once hunted across by the very same people who left their tools in the Aucilla sinkholes. Archaeologists like Morgan Smith have already begun surveying offshore, and the early results are staggering. Quarry sites, paleo river channels, stone tool scatters sitting on the Gulf floor miles from the modern coast. The navigation charts from the original 1980s offshore surveys had such significant coordinate offsets from modern GPS data that researchers spent years unable to relocate sites they had already found. Once those offsets were corrected, the sites reappeared. There are almost certainly hundreds more waiting, and the stakes of finding them could not be higher. Every new site adds data points to questions that matter for all of humanity, not just Florida, not just America. Who were the first people to populate the Western Hemisphere? What route did they take? How did they survive a world that was violently, constantly changing around them? The answers are down there in the dark water, and the archaeologists going after them are just getting started. Think about what it means to leave something behind without knowing you are leaving it behind. The people who camped on the banks of the Aucilla River 14,500 years ago were not thinking about posterity. They were not carving their names into anything or building monuments to be remembered by. They were chipping a knife out of a piece of chert because they needed a knife. They were butchering a mastodon because their family needed to eat. They were watching their children play at the edge of a sinkhole filled with cold, clear water while somewhere out on the grassland, a pack of dire wolves was doing what dire wolves do. They were just living. And then the water came up, slowly and quietly, and it covered their campsites and their tools and their fire pits and their dead, and it locked all of it into the limestone and the sediment in the dark. For 14,000 years, Florida kept their secrets without being asked. Now, a handful of extraordinarily stubborn scientists in wetsuits are going down into that darkness, one careful meter at a time, and bringing those secrets back up into the light. Every flake of chert is a message. Every cut mark on a tusk is a signature. Every coprophilous fungal spore in a sediment core is a data point in a story that belongs to all of us. Because these were not just the first Floridians. They were among the first Americans. And they survived things that would make our modern problems look laughably manageable. Florida has always been a little unhinged. Turns out it has been that way for 15,000 years. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Thanks for watching. Before you head out, don't let your DNA profile just sit there collecting digital dust. Tap the link in the description to download your ebook and finally make sense of it all tonight.